This lesson will be an introduction to life on Earth. And the story that modern science lays out for us is incredible indeed. We begin with a lifeless rock some 4.5 billion years ago, and that transforms into a rock with life, Earth today, with millions of different kinds of species. The key transitional step was the emergence of cellular life, what today we would call bacteria cells. Now, bacteria are the smallest and simplest types of cells on Earth. Here we see some pictures of bacteria. Let's take a look at bacteria in action. Here on the left we see light microscope magnified 1,000 times in the rod-like cells or bacteria cells. And here we see using a different lighting technique called dark field microscopy, but again, living bacteria cells. So these are living entities. They are getting energy from their environment, they're growing, and they're reproducing. It is amazing to think that, again, what modern science is presenting to us is the story that all living things on Earth can trace their ancestry back to these tiny, simple cellular beings. So what happened some 4 billion years ago is chemistry produced a living thing. And once those living things took hold, they reproduced and evolved and spread across the Earth. And so we have then a story, a 4 billion year story of life on Earth, where the first simplest living things spread widely across the face of the planet and evolved into the millions of species we see today. So we want to think of life then as a planetary phenomenon. Living things grew out of a rocky planet. And what do we mean by living thing? Well, we've encountered our definition for life. In most textbooks, you have to have all of these characteristics to be identified as alive. NASA has a sort of a more compact definition, a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. But for us, bacteria then would be the smallest things on Earth that have all of these characteristics. So life on Earth is cellular, and so that is one of the characteristics of life on Earth. All living things are cellular. They're either one cell or made of many cells stuck together. But in addition, living things undergo these other, or have these other properties as well. So what are living bacteria made of? Well, here we have our little bacteria cell here, and we have a breakdown of its composition by mass, by amount of material. So 70% of the mass of a cell is water, with 30% being other kinds of chemicals. And the chemicals are broken up into these categories you see down here. We have proteins, small molecules, RNA, phospholipids, DNA, polysaccharides, and we'll get into sort of what these molecules are and their roles in cells later in the unit. But at this stage, though, most of the material stuff in a cell is water. So let's take a closer look at some of these molecules found in cells. At the center of this diagram, we have a cartoon cell here. It has a membrane boundary, so a three-dimensional membrane boundary. So that defines the interior of the cell and the exterior of the cell. The membrane itself is composed of molecules called lipids. So here's a cartoon picture of the membrane magnified. And a lipid would be one of these structures right here. And the tail of this lipid, we'll define a head, and the tail of the molecule is a fatty acid molecule. For our purposes, just notice that molecules are composed of atoms. And we have already learned that atoms have a long history in the universe. Atoms of all the different kinds of elements were made inside stars and in supernova explosions. So cells are made of star stuff because cells are made of molecules, and molecules are composed of atoms. Here we see a fatty acid is a hydrocarbon. So it's a carbon chain. Carbon atoms linked together by chemical bonds. That's what the dash is there. And then there are hydrogens chemically bonded to the carbons. Over here we have glucose. That's an important energy molecule. And we can see its molecular structure here. In addition, living cells have other kinds of molecules. Proteins, for example, do very important jobs in the cell. They are made of chains of yet smaller molecules called amino acids. And here we see the structure of an amino acid, again made of atoms that were forged inside stars. And of course, DNA. We'll learn about DNA and how that stores information and gets duplicated, etc. DNA is also made of complex molecules made from atoms forged inside stars. So now let's take a look at more of a sort of a functional view of a cell. What can cells do? Well, again, here's our cartoon bacteria. We have the boundary of the cell that defines the inside versus the outside. It's the boundary of the living entity. Now, what cells are doing inside is they're performing lots of chemical reactions. We're going to call that the chemistry of life. And there's an important cast of characters that perform these chemical reactions. They're called proteins, and each protein is specialized to do a different kind of chemical reaction. And together, they perform all the critical functions to keep the cell alive. This chemistry of life includes releasing energy from food, building and repairing cell parts, which are molecules, responding to the environment, reproducing, etc. Now, in order to maintain this chemistry, there has to be an input of energy of some kind. Oftentimes, the cell is going to be eating nutrient molecules in its environment. It will be absorbing important building materials, and some of those molecules contain energy that will be harnessed. So we can think of food as being sort of both building materials and a source of energy. Some cells can capture the energy of light. These would be photosynthetic organisms. But all cells need some input of energy. They've got to get energy from the environment in some way, shape, or form. As they perform the chemistry of life, waste materials are generated, then they must be exported, because if waste molecules build up, it interferes with the chemistry of life. So all living things are importing materials, nutrient molecules, food, capturing energy in some way, and that energy is powering chemistry going on inside the cell, and that chemistry produces waste that must be exported from the cell. Now, the final aspect of cells we'll mention here is how does the cell sort of build these important characters, these proteins? Where did these proteins come from? And that's where DNA enters the picture. DNA is a molecule that stores the information to make all of the important proteins that perform the chemistry of life. So DNA has the recipes for building these critical cell parts. And in fact, then DNA is responsible for reproduction. DNA can be duplicated, and because it can be duplicated, then this living cell can divide into two daughter cells, each with a copy of the recipes to build the all-important proteins. In addition, when DNA is duplicated, sometimes mistakes happen. We call them mutations, and that means that the offspring might be a little different from the parents, and that gives rise to the capacity for evolutionary change. So DNA is the key to life on Earth. It's the hereditary molecule. It stores the instructions for building a living thing, and because it can be duplicated, living things can reproduce, and because in the duplication process mistakes happen, living things can evolve over time. So in summary then, a living cell is composed of molecules with varied chemical properties. The chemistry of life refers to a complex set of chemical reactions that must be sustained within a membrane boundary. And as the molecules interact, they give the cell all of the characteristics on the list. So in other words, when all is working here, when all the proteins are doing their jobs and the chemistry is happening and energy is being harnessed from the environment and waste is being exported, when it's all working right, then the whole cell satisfies everything on this list. And we say the cell is alive. Just to emphasize again, all of this chemistry occurs in water. So most of the interior of the cell is water. Water is good at dissolving lots of molecules and allowing them to chemically interact as they bounce around in the cell. And that, we said, was important in terms of discovering life elsewhere in our galaxy. We're interested in those planets that are in the habitable zone where water could exist as a liquid on the surface. And so it already has been discovered. There are many planets have been discovered already in the habitable zones of their stars. And so scientists will be investigating these planets more closely to see if there are any indications that life has taken hold on those planets. So let's introduce now another kind of analogy to sort of understand cellular life on Earth. And the analogy will be with a car. So here's our cartoon bacteria cell again. We have a membrane, we've got DNA, we've got proteins here. So cells are like modern cars. They have a boundary, an engine, and a computer. And all cells have these three basic functional parts. So first up, the exterior body of the cell would be the cell membrane. That's the boundary between the individual and the environment. So the cell membrane is critically important because in order to perform the chemistry of life, the chemicals, the proteins, and all the molecules must have a confined space for them to interact. If the membrane ruptures, then the molecules will drift away and they can't perform the important chemical reactions needed to sustain life. So the boundary is critically important to keep all of the cell parts together so they interact properly. The engine of the cell would be the many proteins that are processing food and getting energy, building other cell molecules, etc. So the proteins are doing the chemistry of life. We can call that the engine of the cell. And we can think of these proteins, as we will study evolution coming up, we can think of these proteins as adaptations. They evolve to perform different kinds of useful jobs. So just as the giraffe has a long neck that helps it survive by getting food high up and so on, these are molecular adaptations. So proteins are molecules that have evolved by this evolutionary process, as we'll study later. And finally, the computer. The computer of the cell would be the DNA. So DNA stores the information to make all the proteins in the cell, just like sort of a computer storing data. DNA stores the recipes for making proteins and controls the production of them in the cell. It regulates when a protein is made and how much is made. And DNA can be duplicated so that cells can reproduce. So there we have the car analogy. We have the body, the cell membrane, we have the engine, all the proteins doing the chemistry of life, and then we have the computer, the DNA, storing the recipes for building the cell parts. So the story of life on Earth then is one in which hundreds of millions of years of experimental chemistry, possibly happening underneath the oceans in these kind of rocky volcanic chambers here, produced a set of complex molecules that assembled themselves into a living thing. So out of chemistry emerged life. So let's hit some of the key features of life on Earth. Life is cellular, as we've seen. Cells are organized. Living things show organization. So it's not just a random mess inside of a cell. There are molecules that have certain functions, and they can be localized in certain places. So there is an organizational structure to a cell. When all of those molecules and proteins and things are working effectively, the whole assembly of those molecules has the quality that we call life. So all living things must get energy. Cells must get energy. Here we see a cartoon version of the origin of life where the first living cells emerging out of their rocky nurseries. Well, how did they survive? They had to get energy from the environment. They had to be eating molecules in their environment. So all living things must get energy in some way. On Earth, it is DNA that captured the recipe for constructing life. But on another planet, some other molecule must play a similar role if it's going to have the characteristics that we identify as characteristics of life on Earth. And DNA is a critically important molecule for life on Earth. It is the hereditary molecule, which means it has three important features. It carries information to build a living thing. It can be duplicated, which permits reproduction. And it can also change over time, and that allows for future generations to evolve. In this picture, we see a bacteria cell has grown, and now it's dividing. So you can see the little point of division there. Here we see another bacteria cell dividing. So living things, they grow, and living things reproduce. And here we're witnessing one of the simplest life forms, bacteria cells, growing and dividing. In the center here, if we kind of think about the role of DNA in this process, here we have a cartoon bacteria cells, and the DNA is the little green circular thing there called a chromosome. So that's bacterial DNA. Well, what the cell's going to do is duplicate its DNA, so make sort of identical copies here. And then as it divides, one cell splitting into two, each daughter cell will get a copy of the chromosome, so that each daughter cell has all the sets of recipes to build the proteins necessary for the chemistry of life. That's what allows then living things to reproduce with heredity. So the parent is passing on its traits to its offspring because the parent is duplicating its DNA, and DNA has the information for building this parent cell. It is being given to the two daughters here. Now, sometimes when DNA is duplicated, there are these errors, and we call them mutations. So down at the bottom here, the idea is that the daughter cells are not identical to the parent. They're not identical to each other and not identical to the parent. And that means that they might have different characteristics. And that sets up the possibility for an evolutionary process. One of these individuals might have an advantage over another. And so because DNA can change, living things can evolve. So out of the three features of DNA, it's that changeability that permits the evolution of new kinds of living things on Earth. In future lessons, we're going to use this cartoon bacteria cell. And I've illustrated some of the key proteins that are involved in the chemistry of life, and we have DNA over here. So we'll get to the bottom of how a living cell operates using this cartoon bacterium. And that will happen in future lessons.